he is very certainly one of the 5 most important people who have ever lived in the history of the world. Gaius Octavius, who is more usually referred to as Octavia, spent his entire life at the center of Roman politics, where it was constantly stirring. In the beginning, he was Julius Caesar's great-nephew, and he participated in his renowned relative's conquest campaigns. Later on, however, he transformed into the vengeful angel who was responsible for the murder of Caesar's goons, additionally elevated to a position of leadership in the 2nd verse. Following that, he embarked on a conflict with Mark Antony and Cleopatra, a conflict that will decide the very future of Rome at its very core. However, despite the fact that that epic story would be sufficient to fill any video of a standard length, it was simply a preface to the actual event, because it would not be as Octavian that the boy's name would be remembered throughout history. To add insult to injury, Augustus, the first and most powerful Roman emperor. It was under Augustus's rule that everything that we connect with the Roman Empire came into being, despite the fact that he never used the word emperor himself. It was he who was responsible for the dismantling of the Republic, who was the one who turned every bureaucracy into a long-lasting superpower, and who became the leader of a family that would go on to create some of the most notorious rulers in the history of the world. God Octavius was born on September 23, 63 BC, and today's extremely special double-length episode of Biography is going deep into the life of Octavian, the boy who birthed the Roman Empire. Octavian was born on September 23, 63 BC. It was into a world that was already on the edge of extinction when it first appeared. These were the final years in which one might continue to deceive oneself into believing that life in the Roman Republic was normal. Before the first triumvirate, before Caesar's wars, and before the brutal transition into the Roman Empire, these were the final years of Roman political history. The fact that the boy would be the one to gain from all of this mayhem was something that no one who witnessed the birth of the boy could have possibly predicted. However, this does not imply that Octavian came from a difficult background. The boy's father, who is also known as Gaius Octavius, was a member of the wealthy aristocratic hamlet and had the good fortune to marry Julius Caesar's niece. While Julius Caesar was not yet the historical giant that we are familiar with today, he was certainly on his way to becoming one, Colossus or not. Octavia never had a significant amount of time to spend with her great-uncle Julius while he was a child. Indeed, prior to the year 44 BC, it was common practice to refer to him as Octavius. This is merely to get this out of the way. However, given that we are already in the process of changing one of his names to Augustus, we are going to simply refer to him as Octavian, in order to avoid any confusion till then. Because his father passed away when Octavia was only 4 years old, his grandma was the one who took care of his education. It was Julia Minor. Caesar's sister was a woman named Julia Minor. In theory, drawing Octavia closer to one of Rome's most powerful men appeared to be little more than a theoretical proposition. It is highly unlikely that Caesar would have been pleased with what he saw, even if he had paid the youngster a great deal of attention. To put it simply, Octavian was a feeble and ill youngster who had an unhealthy attachment to his mother, all characteristics that the macho Romans looked down upon. Indeed, even when he was a little boy, Octavian demonstrated a natural talent for forming friendships with individuals who possessed qualities that he lacked. People admire Marcus Agrippa because of his athleticism and his might. Octavian, however, possessed a second secret quality, which was something that no one ever witnessed. In the boy's heart there was a burning desire that was so intense that it could even outshine the sun. In the course of his maturation, Octavian gradually started to garner some notice. The funeral for Julia Minor took place in the year 51 BC, and he was selected to deliver the oration during her funeral. He eventually became a member of the Board of Priests or Pons offices, which is a position that is really sought. This occurred a few years later. When Octavian was in the middle of power in the year 50 BC, however, It was the actions of his great uncle that got him there. It was the moment when the epic struggle for Rome reached its conclusion. According to one point of view, the commander Pompey and his followers were attempting to coerce Julius Caesar into relinquishing his position as governor of Gaul. Caesar and Mark Antony, on the other hand, were attempting to coerce Pompey into withdrawing from political activity. The fall of the first triumvirate was brought about by the concluding acts of the collapse. When everything was said and done, there would be only one of the erstwhile allies who would remain standing. And even if you are already aware of who that is going to be, on January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar marched his army across a little brook that was known as the Rubicon and into history. Italy itself serves as the barrier between salt and gold in Italy. The Rubicon was a significant event. If you crossed it with an army, you were instantly declaring war on the enemy. The name Caesar was established as a result of this declaration. Upon receiving the news of the invasion, Pompey escaped Italy, leaving Caesar to pursue him. Caesar went on to pursue Caesar. Over the course of the subsequent years of violence, it was Octavian's heartfelt request that he be permitted to battle beside his great uncle. Nevertheless, it was too young, too much of a child, to be a member of the military. However, two events did emerge from the civil war that would have a significant impact on Octavian's life and circumstances. The first of these was the fact that his pals, Marcus Agrippa brother, were taken captive by Caesar in North Africa while they were battling for the Pompeian crown. Immediately after Agrippa received the news, he pleaded with Octavian to spare the life of his. A proper request for Caesar's forgiveness was made by Octavian. Caesar's agreement came as a complete surprise to everyone. After that, Agrippa would become an unwavering supporter of Octavian's cause completely. The second, however, was more indirect. Mark Antony, who was in charge of Rome itself, was given Caesar's phone number while he was engaged in combat. On the other hand, Antony was such a sluggish frat guy that he came dangerously close to starting a revolution. In the year 46 BC, when Caesar finally made his return, he was so enraged by this that he exiled Antony. Within a short period of time, Julius Caesar found himself in a position where he required a possible successor. More than anything else, it was this need that would put Octavius on the path that would lead to his notoriety. In the absence of Antony, who was wallowing in Gaul, Octavian was given the opportunity to accompany Caesar on the triumphal march celebrating his victory in Africa. With that being said, this was but a brief respite for, in the year 45 BC, elderly Julius gallops off once more, this time to Hispania to engage in combat with the sons of Pompeianus and Sextus. The plan was for little Octavian to travel with his great uncle instead of going on his own. Instead, the little child was compelled to watch in horror as his body betrayed him to everyone else. In the previous sentence, we mentioned that Octavius was sick, but perhaps it is necessary for us to take a moment here to highlight how sick he was. Throughout his entire life, he would be plagued by ailments that would render him unable to work for a period of time ranging from months to years, leaving him trapped at the border of death, just a hair's breadth away from passing away. He was unable to accompany Caesar since he was suffering from one of these incapacitating ailments. Not a single person in Rome was aware of this, of course. In their minds, it was nothing more than a coward. In ancient Rome, this was a terrible accusation that would have caused more harm than it would in modern times. The situation left Octavian with no other option, and he had to summon the kind of determination that is typically reserved for ultramarathons. Octavian compelled his aching body to get out of bed, to leave Rome, and to ride out to Hispania in order to meet his grand uncle. In spite of the fact that the battle had already been won by the time he arrived, it was still a prudent decision on his part. Caesar made the observation that Octavian could not have reasonably foreseen the outcome before he went out, which meant that there was a high probability that he would ride into Hispania and be slaughtered by Pompey's sons. Caesar is essentially stating, guys, it turns out that my great-nephew is not a struggling coward after all. That is the meaning of his statements. How is it, on the other hand, Octavian's trip back home was a blessing in disguise for him during that time? Despite the fact that he was only 18 years old at the time, the first lad was given the privilege of riding in Caesar's carriage. Caesar, however, made the decision to take a detour and make amends with Mark Antony over the situation. Antony was the one who accompanied Caesar on the remainder of the journey back to the house. In spite of this, it appears that Octavian had left a favorable impression. In the course of this expedition, Caesar would make the decision that would forever change the course of history by modifying his will. Warning: this is a spoiler for the year 2000. Mark Antony is not going to have a happy ending to his story. As soon as Caesar returned to Rome, he gave Octavian a prestigious position as a strong administrator in order to assist him in learning the ropes of politics. At the same time, Julius began to behave in a manner that was increasingly reminiscent of that of an old king, a fact that was completely unknown to everyone during the period of 45 BC. In addition to engaging in public relations, stunts like his having laurel crown covertly placed atop statues of him across the city, he was successful in convincing the Senate to extend its time as dictator. By the time February 44 BC rolled around, the Senate had come to the conclusion that the only way to prevent Caesar from becoming king in the literal sense was to kill him. On the other hand, Octavian would not be present to bear witness to the events that transpired on the Ides of March. In the spring of that year, he and Agrippa journeyed to Apollinaire in the region that is now known as Albania in order to finish their military education. It was on March 15th when the senators of Caesar stabbed the dictator to death, and there they were. On the other hand, Mark Antony was in Rome at the time when the news was made public. He ran away from the city, certain that he would be the next victim. Cicero is credited with uttering the famous line, "The Ides of March was a fine deed, but done only half." He meant that Antony had not been murdered by anyone. Octavian had not been murdered by anyone who had traveled to Paulina, rather than being perplexed. After a long absence, Antony returned in late March and resumed his role as just consul. In addition, one of his first actions was to set out on the ocean. The experience of reading the contents must have been comparable to being set down and kicked in the nuts by the ghost of Caesar. Caesar's will provided that Octavian would be adopted by Caesar after his death. In addition to this, the boy would be given almost all of his money. The old soldier and Octavian have been engaged in a competition ever since Antony read these words. This competition began at that same moment, an animosity and a rivalry that would have a lasting impact on Rome's future for many generations, and the conflict would not be resolved until either one of the guys or both of them had passed away. The news of the Ides of March compelled Octavian to make a decision that would have a significant impact on his life, whether he should go back to Rome or simply run away into the night. While the boy howled, almost everyone was saying, "Dude, you should definitely run." This was the impromptu advice that was given. Your great-uncle was recently taken out by these individuals. It is most likely going to be the following date. However, there was one notable outlier. Marcus Agrippa said, "This was ancient bull feces of the highest kind." According to a great soldier who had declared it by this point, he strongly encouraged Octavian to go back to Rome and become a man. It is a sign of hubris to claim. It would not be the first time that Octave would have been spared by Agrippa's wisdom in eons. However, during the spring of that year, the little kid went back to the Eternal City and discovered that the events were taking place at a quick pace. Assassins such as Cassius and Brutus were forced to escape Rome, with less success as a result of Mark Antony's successful efforts to incite the populace against the conspirators. In addition to this, he attempted to give the impression that Caesar had genuinely bequeathed his money to the Roman people and had not in any way adopted any of his children after his death. Consequently, when Octavia came to terms with the reality, he also came to the realization that Antony was aiming for him. In addition, this was unfortunate for Antony, since one of the most fundamental principles of ancient Rome was that you should never collaborate with Octavian. and this was especially true when you were already a walking public relations disaster zone. The first significant error that Antony made was to attempt to make peace with the Senate after he had already heated up the crowd. This made it possible for Octavian to tell the crowd, "Look, guys, he is betraying you," and it also put Antony in a particularly difficult position. The second worst act, which was so unstable that individuals such as Cicero eventually came to the conclusion that Antony posed a threat to the Republic and started advocating for Octavian as an alternative president. The third and most likely most significant error that Antony made was to invade Gaul and conduct an assault on the country. A relatively complicated situation with Antony's consulship coming to an end in the Senate, with the Senate intending to send him back to Macedonia, is the reason why. On the other hand, the primary purpose of the event was to demonstrate the Senate's strength. Honestly, this was way too much. Around the beginning of the year 43 BC, Antony was labeled an enemy of the state. After receiving authorization from the Senate, Octavia was given the authority to take 2 legions, remove Alban Gaul, and defeat the renegade commander. On the other hand, they did not place Octavian in command of the campaign because he was still a young man and had not yet been tried. The youngster would be required to serve under the supervision of 2 consuls who would assist him in maintaining his discipline. The reason that neither of their names is being mentioned is for a very good reason. As soon as Octavian had obtained possession of all of this gold, he proceeded to murder both of them and take command of the forces that were opposed to Antony. This must be an increase then. Last but not least, the confrontation between the 2 massive armies led by Antony and Octavian. Rome's future was at stake in this historic conflict. Not quite, to be sure. This occurred as the 2 guys faced one another across the rugged landscape of the mountains. It would appear that both of them had come to an important realization. Now that they are separated from one another, they may fight and depart the victorious. That is a sluggish return to a Senate that is both arrogant and treacherous. It is also possible for them to band together and become unstoppable. This meeting took place on a small island in the middle of a river in October of 43 BC, after Octavian, Antony, and another Caesar adherent called Marcus, simply as Lepidus, had engaged in a great deal of political maneuvering. A structure for their 3-way alliance, which would come to control Rome for the next 30 years, was then hammered out over the course of 2 days by the group. The second reason for it is the name of the name. The departure of Cassius and Brutus to the east has been kind of forgotten, but it has surely been placed to the side in the midst of the commotion that has been caused by the confrontation between Octavian Antony and the other conspirators. On the other hand, the bout for the championship had been postponed. Since its start, the traitors have been the focus of everyone's attention. The second verse made it their primary mission to locate the individuals responsible for the assassination. For this, they were going to require a certain amount of money. Late in the year 43 BC, the prohibitions were enacted. The upcoming battle was supported by selecting 2,000 Roman citizens at random and requiring them to give up their lives and possessions. On the other hand, there was absolutely no randomness involved. In addition, each and every one of those 2,000 people was irate. "Oh, Octavian, is it Lepidus or Antony?" The names of persons on the lists were made public, and anyone on those lists might be killed without facing any consequences. Alongside approximately 2,000 members of their Queen's class, which consisted of Romans from the middle class who owned land and had sufficient wealth to acquire their own armor and horses, there were a total of 300 senators who were killed. Cicero, an old adversary of Antony and a friend of Octavian, was one of the people who passed away. His savage death consisted of showing his assassins his neck and saying, "Get it right the first time." Following the conclusion of the slaughter, Octavian and Antony traveled to the east in order to eliminate the traitors, leaving Lepidus in charge of Rome. When Octavian and Antony temporarily left the Republic in the year 42 BC, it was one of the most divided republics that anyone had ever seen. Both Brutus and Cassius had not simply escaped to the east. They had effectively taken control of vast swaths of country and were now considered to be the East. Meanwhile, a far smaller army of Republicans was in command of the seas at the same time. In the midst of them stood Sextus, Pompey's son, who had miraculously evaded capture during the conflict in Hispania. Nevertheless, the Second Triumvirate continued to operate effectively in spite of the surrounding shocks. Because they were powerful enough, in September of 42 BC, they were able to locate Cassius and Brutus and force them to engage in combat. Unfortunately for Octavian, it was yet another instance in which his body failed to function properly, and Antony was the one who passed away, entering the arena to fight and achieve glory. Very close to the same extent as when he dragged himself to Hispania in order to be with Caesar. By some miracle, Octavian was able to bring his broken body onto the battlefield in order to see that victory. In a humorous turn of events, the combat ended however, Cassius, who was observing the situation from a hillside, could only witness his own camp being taken over. In the event that it was unsuccessful, he took his own life. Both Octavian and Antony were able to blow through their injuries the following month, and they did so as if they were being blown by divine winds. Following Brutus's decision to take his own life, Octavian removed his head and returned it to Rome, where it was placed in front of a statue of Caesar. After that win, the triumph is split up, with Octavian going back to Rome and Antony remaining in the east. Octavian returned to Rome, but Antony remained in the east. However, prior to their parting ways, Octavian struck deals with his adversary, one of which essentially divided the Republic into three parts. The majority of the western region, with the exception of Antony's stronghold in Gaul, was taken over by Octavian. The majority of the eastern region was taken over by Antony, and those undesirable parts that were not desired by anyone were thrown to Lepidus. Certainly, it is the case in theory, or at least in practice. On the island of Sicily, the Republic was actually split into four separate entities. With the establishment of his own kingdom and the blockade of Rome's ports, Sextus Pompey was having the time of his life. A major headache brought on by food shortages and unrest was what Octavian had to cope with when he finally made it back to Rome. He was not there to celebrate his victory by marching around the city. In addition to this, he was responsible for demobilizing his own troops, which required him to seize land for them to live on, which resulted in additional riots. And while all of this was going on, Antony was off swanning around the east, looking like the great hero that he had always entertained the idea of being. At this point, if you were an observer from the outside, it is highly likely that you would ever see him. In this situation, Dr. Avian was the weak link. In the perspective of the present world, his polling would be in a downward spiral. If Saturday Night Live had hired a Baldwin brother to impersonate him, the network would have been making a series of public relations mistakes, similar to the occasion when he hosted a dinner in the midst of a famine. However, statistics have demonstrated over and again that polls are not always accurate. In the year 41 BC, Octavian may have appeared to be in a precarious position, but in truth, he was only 10 years away from being the most powerful man on the planet. You are in for a rude awakening since it does not take 10 years. Squarespace is the best option for you if you want to create a fantastic website with today's sponsors. It is more likely to feel like 10 seconds, taking into consideration that it is the new year. Whatever it is that you are considering doing is going to be canceled. The moment has come to go through with Squarespace. A platform that should be utilized is Squarespace. If you want to get started on that online project, you are perhaps looking for a way to get in and out of it quickly without having to worry too much about the appearance of your website. The Slam. To create a website that is up to date, you can make use of one of those simple and gorgeous themes. And for you, it's as if it's been taken straight off the packaging. It is not difficult. Or perhaps you are the type of person who is a little bit more hands-on. At this point, you have some ideas about how you would like things to appear. To begin, You can either start from scratch or edit that template in any way you see fit. There are no updates, patches, or other technical issues to be concerned about once you have created your websites. Additionally, there are no updates available. After you have finished configuring your website and making any necessary adjustments to the layout, Squarespace also offers a plethora of additional capabilities that would be beneficial to the success of your website. If you are interested in exploring these options, you can do so. Members-only areas, social integrations, email marketing campaigns, and patronage portals are all examples. Data analysis, alternatives for business. Do I have to continue while I provide help around the clock? As you may already be aware, I have been working with Squarespace for a considerable amount of time, even longer than the duration of this video. Additionally, I will mention that I utilize Scrapspace in order to create a website for one of my other channels, which is Megaprojects. Megaprojects.net is the location where you may locate it. I have absolutely no design abilities, and I have no web skills at all. Plus, it was so simple, and I just finished making this. My opinion is that it is straightforward, yet the website that is created with Squarespace Megaprojects.net looks fantastic. If you are interested in perusing it, you should use Squarespace whenever you are ready to begin working on the next project of yours, regardless of how big or how small it may be. Visit squarespace.com to get a free trial of their service. When you are ready to launch your business, go to squarespace.com and click on the /biographics link. If you make your first purchase of a website or domain, you will receive a discount of 10%. Alright, let's circle back around to the young man who would feel ashamed. However, the formal duration of the second triumvirate would not end until the year 33 BC. In the year 41 BC, when Octavian was still reeling from the blockade and the riots, while it had spent nearly its whole life on the verge of violent collapse, it came dangerously close to falling apart. There were some of Antony's ancestors who attempted to topple the young from that location. However, as we have already mentioned, the most important guideline associated with surviving Rome is to avoid working with Octavian. The group of rebels was defeated by the boy and Agrippa. Next, Octavian marched to the north and snatched Antony's province of Gaul from his possession. In Antony's eyes, this is comparable to Octavius. It had just gotten into his house, stomped on his PlayStation 5, and assaulted his mother. It was all an unpleasant experience. What a furious general he was. I am so enraged. In an effort to put an end to the boy's life, he attempted to form an alliance with Sextus Pompey. Therefore, Octavian was able to outwit him. With the intention of gaining his favor, Sextus actually married Ione on Scrap. And even though it is quite unlikely that we will bring up Ceremonia once again in this video, you should be aware that she was not even close to being a historical ignoble. It was predicted that one of her great-grandsons would one day become Emperor Caligula, and that her great-great-grandson would one day become Emperor Nero. In any case, the end result of all of this was that Antony went completely off the rails and laid siege to Rome, and Octavian came out to battle him. This is not a terrible performance for a two-line side counter. However, at this point in time, everyone was so exhausted by everything that was going on during the Civil War that both of their legions refused to engage in combat. To put it simply, they simply declined, but they were fairly exhausted. You should just figure it out on your own. Not a problem. In this way, a decisive conflict between the two most formidable adversaries was once again avoided. Antony, on the other hand, allowed Octavian to reclaim Gaul while he married Octavia, the boy's sister. In light of this, the chamber engaged in peace negotiations with Sextus. And as soon as it was decided, Octavian went ahead and divorced poor old Ceremonia the moment it was agreed upon. On the very same day that she gave birth to his daughter Julia, she decided to end her relationship with Livia and move in with her. Is that Drusilla? Considering that Livia already had a kid at this point in time, and that child was going to grow up to become Emperor Tiberius. This marriage would turn out to be a marriage of destiny. After that, it was immediately back to plotting and fighting with one another. Even as Antony was making his way back to the east, Octavian was working hard to finally prevail against Sextus. Sextus ran, or should we say sailed rings around him, resulting in a naval battle that took place in 38 BC and nearly resulted in the boy's death in the heart of the conflict. However, despite the fact that he might have been crafty, he just did not possess the tactical talents that Sextus possessed. Antony insisted that they transfer 120 of his ships for 4 of Octavian's legions in order to keep the deal alive after the first term of the triumvirate had expired. Octavia and being Octavia, it was all like, yeah, she'll think dead, and took Antony's ships and then refused to send him any legions, probably while laughing his ass off. Octavia was the one who did this. On the other hand, what could New Zealand do? It was 36 BC when other triumvirate laborers attempted to take Sextus's old region. Octavian's fortunes were already turning, and his men under Marcus Agrippa beat Sextus that year. This put a stop to Octavian's final attempt to challenge Sextus's authority. It was Octavian who took him from his position and relegated him to the position of Pontifex Maximus, which was a significant but powerless position. Mark Antony was the only person who stood in the way of Octavian's ambitions, despite the fact that Lepidus had taken the job without making any complaints. Fortunately, it was during this very same time that the wheels began to fall off the Antony train. At the same time that Octavian was finding his footing in Ryan, Antony had been busy getting his butt kicked, conquering Parthia, and then parading around Alexandria like a new pharaoh in waiting. Even though Cleopatra was dependent on the graces of the Romans for her survival, Egypt was still independent at this point of time, which was the Ptolemaic period. However, once Antony had established a relationship with the queen, he began to engage in activities such as declaring Caesarine, the son of Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar, king of kings, to be his own. When viewed from the point of view of the Romans, this was the screw-up that would end all screw-ups, and Antony was attempting to kneecap it. The assertion made by Octavian that he is Caesar's sole successor, the image that he gave off, on the other hand, was that of someone who was roughly the size of the hand half of Rome to a group of Egyptian mucks. What a ridiculous idea it was. At this point, all that was required of Octavian was to avoid making any blunders of his own, and by default the people would all come together in support of him, and that is precisely what transpired over the course of the subsequent few years. Octavian focused on bolstering support, following public games, while concurrently spreading propaganda about Antony going native. Antony attempted to shoot back, saying that Octavian only became Caesar's successor after courting the old man. Octavian's efforts were unsuccessful. When it came to this game, he was simply not very good. It was Octavian who made a huge song and dance about voluntarily giving up power when the second term of the triumvirate terminated at the end of the year 33 BC, leaving Antony appearing like the horrible dictators who were unwilling to cede control. It goes without saying that Octavian did not truly give up anything substantial other than a title. Even after this, he continued to exercise power in a dictatorial manner, which resulted in 1/3 of the Senate leaving Rome to join Antony in. However, the perception of the general population was the most important factor. Moreover, Octavian was an expert in the shadowy arts of ancient public relations. It was in the year 32 BC that the now extremist war of words reached its. That particular year, Octavia and her sister were divorced by Antony, which was an atrocious action of contempt. After receiving this remark, Octavian stormed inside the Holy Temple, where Antony's will was being kept, and removed it. The disrespectful behavior toward a temple was a stupid decision. It was possible that it would have caused Octavian's stock to fall. After that, however, Octavia read the will and concluded that his bet had been successful. It was Antony's intention to leave the entire eastern region of the Republic to the queen, who was not Roman. It was Cleopatra. This is an act of treason. It was the final straw that broke the camel's back for Antony's supporters in Rome, not long after the Senate gave Octavian permission to go to war. In the end, however, it would not be Octavian who was responsible for Antony's demise. It would be Antony's own head-scratching foolishness on his part. Antony was too afraid to just charge in and invade Italy, despite the fact that he had sent his army off to fight at the head of a massive fleet. Then he, in a bay on the Ionian Sea, Hungary is attacked and defeated. Marcus Agrippa then blockaded the bay on favor of Octavian, which resulted in Antony being trapped in a dismal siege with no way out. Antony was starved over the course of the subsequent few months by the Agrippa blockade. In other words, they simply starved him. Malnutrition was the cause of death for a significant number of his soldiers. While everything was going on, Octavian was sending troops overland in an effort to prevent Antony from escaping. Finally, on September 2, 31 BC, a weak and desperate Tanzania attempted to break the blockade with the ships that remained in. It would be absolutely disastrous for one's career. The Battle of Actium was such a one-sided encounter that it became synonymous with a humiliating defeat at the hands of the enemy, akin to the Battle of Waterloo. When it came to fighting, Napoleon had merely been extremely poor. Despite the fact that Antony and Cleopatra were able to flee, the navy of Antony was completely destroyed. They suffered a complete loss. In order to add salt to the wound, Octavian then extended an offer of clemency to the individuals who had survived, so enabling Antony's forces to demobilize with dignity. This was a very clear statement. Antony is the subject of this discussion. If you desert him immediately, you will be saved. A message that would immediately find its audience was what was being sent. While this was going on, Octavian and Agrippa were making preparations for an invasion of Egypt around the winter of 3130 BC. They understood that this could be a difficult battle, despite the fact that the wind was blowing in their favor. Home ground for Egypt was Egypt. This is Antony. If you were to break his rule, what would it take? In the end, the response was not very significant. Egypt was the target of Octavian's army's final assault, which took place in the spring of that year, at the same time as Octavius himself was advancing through Syria on foot. His enormous navy was making its way to Alexandria. On the other hand, there would be very little fighting when they saw Octavian and Agrippa bearing down on them with their fangs, their eyes set on fire. In a collective manner, Antony's soldiers mumbled the Latin equivalent of "screw this" and then left the area. It was already too late for Octavian to arrive in the city. His former adversary had already taken his own life. Despite this, Octavian enjoyed himself. It was only after he had stripped Cleopatra of everything and paraded her around in a humiliating manner through the streets of Rome that he agreed to spare her life. He had Cleopatra brought before him to beg for her life. On the other hand, Cleopatra chose to end her life rather than confront this destiny. The only thing that remained for Octavian to do after that was to have the young Caesarion put to death, which would eliminate his last prospective competitor. Finally, he was Rome's unrivaled ruler without any opposition. Now then, we are in this. This is well over 20 minutes in. Around the same time, in any typical video, wherever would you be? You are appreciated for watching. I'm going to assume that Squarespace, the sponsor, has instructed you to press the like button and then roll the credits. Nevertheless, this is not a typical video. An Octavian-related video can be seen here. It is highly likely that he was the most significant figure in the entire history of Rome. A man who accomplished so much significant work that it would be impossible to narrate his narrative within a normal time span could be described as such. Through his participation in a number of different civil wars, we have already witnessed him alter the path that history would take. Our eyes witnessed him exact revenge on his uncle, bring down Mark Antony, and seize control of the entire republic. However, as we cautioned you in the start, this is just the beginning for the victorious Octavian, who is only 33 years old and is ruling over a devastated Egypt. The actual work had not yet been completed due to the fact that Octavian was victorious. The political landscape of the Mediterranean region underwent a significant transformation. The western and eastern regions of the Roman Republic were no longer divided into two distinct zones of power under the Roman Republic. The independence of Egypt was no longer a reality, while the country had not quite been incorporated into Rome either. Instead, it is Egypt's. In a single second, Octavian became one of the wealthiest individuals in the history of the world, since he had acquired the entire country of Egypt as his own property. Neither was it limited to Egypt's. The boy strong-armed the Centers into awarding Antony lordship over Gaul, Hispania, and Syria less than 30 months after Antony's sad-end finishes. This occurred after the boys had armed the Centers. To put it another way, Octavian had established his very own secret empire within the larger republical structure. However, the condition of play was not limited to the maps alone when it came to change. On the other hand, there were changes that took place behind the scenes. Above all else, this was included on the list of killings that Octavian had ordered to be carried out against Antony's loyalists. If you were the governor of an area that had taken the side of the deceased general, what would you do? Now, I'm sorry to say this, but Octavian was going to add your body to his list of confirmed kills in towns. Do you understand? No ill will toward you. In spite of the fact that Octavian was nothing short of a cruel individual, he was still capable of displaying moments of magnanimity. An unexpectedly high proportion of Antony's longtime pals managed to survive the purge. It was surprising in the sense that the number was not zero, and it also included a random historical crossover notice. Herod the Great was emperor. However, Octavian's maneuverings went a step further than simply slaughtering. All of the political elite was thrown into disarray, leaving behind just those who were either loyal to Octavia or afraid of her. Despite this, the young man was always careful to avoid making the same mistake that Julius Caesar did, which was to actually make himself out to be a tyrant. When he announced his departure from public life on January 27 BCE, he even made a huge show out of declaring his retirement. It was all a hoax, that much is obvious. The Senate pleaded with him to remain until Octavian responded with a resounding no. After that, the Senate responded with a sad outburst of joy by bestowing upon him the title of Revered One, all well then, or as we are more familiar with it, Augustus. Octavian, the ruthless and ambitious youngster, would begin to disappear from this moment on, and Augustus, the ruthless and ambitious man, would take his place. In addition, in contrast to Octavius previously, this time we will also be altering the manner that we refer to him as a result of his most recent honor. Augustus, the first citizen of Rome, fled the city because of his new riches, making our way to golden Hispania in order to engage in some conflict. Unfortunately, Augustus's frail body failed him once more, and he was forced to spend more than a year of his life in bed, with Hispania coming dangerously close to passing away. Rome in the year 24 BC continues to resonate with his comeback. Merely provide a brief reprieve. Even for a man who had spent his whole life in a kind of prolonged dance with the Grim Reaper, Augustus fell gravely ill in the year 23 BC, which was a very tragic event. This was things in a whole new level. Everyone was under the impression that it was the conclusion, which was a significant issue. Instead of Julius Caesar, who came before him, Augustus did not have a mobile application. Certainly, he had spent the previous few years cultivating both his own nephew Marcus and Livia's son Tiberius, both of whom were his nephews. For the part, Claudius Marcellus was chosen. On the other hand, they were both still two young sons, and he was dying, and he was frantic to give the empire to someone he could trust. Nevertheless, they were both still young. Augustus did the only thing that made sense to him, which was to create Marcus Aurelius. Plus, this was a fantastic option to go with. The Senate was on good terms with Agrippa, who was well-liked and respected by the Senate. It is possible that when the sun is out, it is a little too good. On their way out, they said something along the lines of, "Great, don't let the door hit you. It is all right, Augustus." This is not a joke, by the way. The vast majority of them would have been content if the first citizen had passed away at that time, and that Augustus had, unfortunately for them, somehow managed to stay alive. And once he had recovered, he made it a point to establish once more that the cardinal rule of Rome was in effect. On July 23, the commencement of the year 23 BC, Augustus successfully forced the Senate to yield over the power that it still possessed. The instant that they gave in is remarkable because it was the very last moment that could have been feasible. Due to the fact that it is not an exact science, you are able to determine the date that the Roman Republic came to an end. The ending of the Republic is widely considered to have occurred either at the time of Cicero's assassination in 43 BC, or the metamorphosis of Octavian into Augustus, which occurred 6 years later. Although there are others who believe that this is premature, there is no question in anyone's mind regarding the current state of affairs. On the other hand, you cut it by July 23 of the year BC. 100% of the Roman Republic had been buried alive. From this point forward, a narrative is taking place within the Roman Empire, following Augustus's most recent attempt to seize power. At the very least, on a personal level, the new empire got off to a difficult start. Marcellus, Augustus's nephew, passed away at the end of the year 23 BC, leaving him abruptly without any heirs. With a submissive Senate that was obviously grieving for Agrippa, the first citizen started to become nervous by making his old friends, and he realized that he had actually just established a dangerous new opponent for himself. However, if you were anticipating that, you would now learn that Augustus performed a traditional Roman emperor organs at a grape that was offered to the lions. You should be aware that this specific narrative does not unfold in that manner. An organization that had been his closest companion ever since he was a child. There was no room for open fighting or murder in this scenario. In order for Augustus to successfully eliminate the dangers posed by Agrippa and ensure the survival of his companion, there was only one method that could be considered. 21 BC was the year that Marcus Agrippa tied the knot with his bride. Julia, Augustus's daughter, who was 18 years old at the time, another girl, became his bride. Literally on the same day that Davian divorced a mother in order to play the salami with Livia and Agrippa, the baby was born. From this point forward, Augustus, his son-in-law, did not have to be concerned about him gaining any ideas. Of course, Agrippa would never have done it. In the same way that he had always been, he remained unwavering and committed to Augustus. He did not even come close to plotting his way to the top. He was looking forward to settling down with Julia and having a large number of children. When the time came for her to mature, one of these children would be renowned throughout history as Agrippina the grandmother. Should weed a guy named Germanicus and have her own son named Little Boot while she is married to him? Then why are we the ones to tell you this? It is because the Latin word for little boots is Caligula, which is also the name of the future emperor, who is completely insane. To tell you the truth, all of these off-topic discussions about the family tree are among the most fascinating aspects of Augustus's latter life. While this was going on, he was also establishing the groundwork for the Roman Empire. In addition to this, it was creating the groundwork for the family that would later decide the course of its early fortunes. This is Tiberius Caligula. The Claudius, it was Nero. These names are engraved into history, and even after 2,000 years, they are still recognizable. In addition, the majority of these games were able to come into existence because of Augustus's dynastic games. If we are going to talk about the foundations of the empire, then we should probably talk about the changes that Augustus implemented. The Roman bureaucracy was like a ship that was creaking, ancient, and deteriorating, and it was just one hole away from fully sinking when the first citizen came to power. The practice of bribery was widespread. it was very easy to take advantage of the private tax collection system. Extortion is encouraged in this manner. On a yearly basis, important official posts were regularly filled by political appointees, which meant that those in charge of the operation were primarily concerned with ensuring that they were in the best possible position. Augustus dismissed the entire corrupt system from existence. Augustus is credited with establishing Rome's first professional class of civil servants who were selected based on their qualities. In addition to transferring ownership of a tax collection to the state, Augustus was also responsible for transferring ownership of the fire and police departments in the city of Rome. The sudden occurrence of a house bursting into flames was no longer a problem that was exclusive to you. The poor roads that plagued the regions were no longer merely a source of complaint for the hawks. They were also no longer overlooked. Augustus made improvements to the infrastructure of the empire by fixing old highways, constructing new roads, and establishing a standing navy to be responsible for patrolling the Mediterranean and protecting shipping. Although this was a lot less dramatic than Octavian and Antony chasing each other over the world and engaging in combat, it was still a lot more exciting. However, do you know what? Over the course of time, it was most likely of greater significance. Augustus inherited an outdated and disorganized Rome when he gained control of it. It is possible that it was not quite on the verge of collapsing, but it was also not going to survive as a 476 AD not undergoing a significant redesign. Well, Augustus was the one who brought it back into shape, and he did such a very amazing job that even the presence of several terrible emperors who followed him were not able to bring it back together. The army is transformed into a professional fighting force that is funded by the public treasury under his leadership. The Roman forces had always relied on their generals for financial support up until this point. This means that individuals such as Caesar or Octavian were able to efficiently govern legions without being subject to oversight under Augustus. All of that was different. In order to encourage soldiers to place their loyalty in their leaders, incentives were withdrawn. Instead, incentives such as pensions for veterans and care for the wounded were introduced in order to encourage soldiers to place their loyalty in the empire. When considered as a whole, these changes completely altered the empire, virtually ensuring that it would have a long and robust existence. Regrettably, the most important lesson that can be learned from this is that statecraft is dependent on the mundane material just as much as it is on the conquering and drama. This is a lesson that the majority of Augustuses as they got to learn. It is all too easy to slide into portraying our subjects as either completely nice or completely evil when we do on videos like these, even when they are twice as long as they normally are. This is the problem with doing on videos like these. By doing so, time is saved, the story is simplified, and the situation is prevented from becoming excessively complicated. On the other hand, that is not how history actually unfolds for us. Only a small percentage of people are sociopaths who are either completely incompetent or completely. Therefore, after we have just praised the first citizen, let us now bring him down and assault him by investigating the darkest part of his personality. During Augustus's whole reign, morals regulations were one of the components that received the least amount of support. In modern times, we have a perception of Rome as a place that is somewhat hedonistic. Nevertheless, this was not always the case, and it was certainly not the case when Augustus was in power, beginning in the year 18 BC. The first citizens embarked on a war against immorality, which included the passage of a contentious law that made adultery a crime against the state. Adulterers were subject to consequences in the courtroom, and if they were female, they were even subject to the possibility of being executed. At the same time, Augustus made an effort to encourage marriage by enacting more regulations that were intended to make living without a spouse difficult, expensive, and not worth the effort. The shock was that Augustus himself was a serial adulterer who was swindling around Rome like some kind of wealthy and hypocritical rabbit. It was necessary for the war in Germania, which was aimed at expanding the limits of the empire all the way to Elba, to be another strike against the German citizen. In the year 17 BC, Augustus waged war on all of the tribes that were located to the north. Long, brutal, and ultimately fruitless, the conflict would eventually reach its climax in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which took place in the year 9 AD, on account of the fact that it was so comprehensive that it effectively put an end to Roman expansionism. It is one of the few instances in which the Roman army was completely exterminated by an external force. Up until the time that Claudius conquered Britain, which was at least 40 years later. Therefore, you shouldn't be under the impression that Augustus's sole objective was to exercise enlightened tyranny and to make the empire a better place. Nevertheless, Augustus's attention was laser-focused elsewhere on the matter that would preoccupy him for the rest of his reign, which was to ensure that he had an heir with Marcellus' debt. This concern was the reason that Augustus was able to fulfill his obligation to Marcellus. There was still the matter of the first citizen having to fall back on, together with his steps and clothes. The lines, however, were not blood, despite the fact that they were fine. When Augustus returned, he immediately resumed his previous dynastic games. The first thing he did was coerce Tiberius and Dresses into marrying within his extended family. This was done to ensure that he would have some connection to their offspring. Dresses would be the father of both Germanicus, also known as Caligula's father, and Claudius, who would later become emperor. This afforded us the opportunity to observe the unfolding of the future somewhat. Even if we are aware that this family tree is completely ridiculous, it is nevertheless incredibly interesting to observe how much the wealth of the empire is owing to Augustus, who was responsible for forcing everyone to marry each other. Augustus, on the other hand, adopted the two kids that Marcus Agrippa had fathered with Julia. This was the second thing that Augustus did. Beginning at a young age, Augustus was responsible for the upbringing of Goths and Lucius as the first citizens. That must have been the ideal blend of the two of them. The blood of his daughter Julia, who was his sixth child, was combined with the blood of his oldest and most devoted friends. What could possibly go wrong with the situation? Regrettably, for the sake of Rome's future, things were about to continue in a direction that was extremely detrimental to the city. In the year 12 BC, the initial blow fell. In the same year, Marcus Agrippa, who was 51 years old at the time, went to the Balkans in order to get ready for a forthcoming military operation. A terrible illness struck him while he was there, and despite the efforts of his people to bring him back to Rome, he passed away while they were on their way. It was a devastating blow to Augustus when he learned the news. He rode out and followed the body as it made its way back to Rome, where he gave the order for Agrippa to be laid to rest in his own mausoleum he had constructed. In the course of that journey, it is fascinating to speculate about the thoughts that must have been running through Augustus's head. The body of the man who had been with him from the very beginning was right there in front of him. It was the individual who persuaded him to go back to Rome after the Ides of March, who had been the most important factor in his victory over Antony. It is inconceivable. Augustus was conscious of the fact that his life had just crossed its own Rubicon, a moment from which there was no turning back when one was in a significant amount of debt. On his own, the first citizen was now a free man. In addition, although things wouldn't be completely bleak from this point on, it was undeniably going to be challenging. Following the passing of Marcus Agrippa, there was yet another piece of unfortunate news. It was in the year 9 BC, when Justus was killed when he fell from his horse, leaving Augustus once again without any successors. Despite the fact that he was still responsible for the upbringing of Agrippa's sons, Goths, and Lucius, both of them were much too young to take over in the event that another disease took the life of the first citizen. Therefore, Augustus focused all of his attention on Tiberius, elevating him to a position of authority and even compelling him to wed Julia, a widow of the Greek. Augustus, on the other hand, had either forgotten fundamental aspects of human psychology or had never learned them. Being told what to do is something that people dislike. When they are forced to divorce their marriages and marry older women, It is a painful experience as a result of the fact that they share nothing in common with the stupid, abstract notions. It is possible that Tiberius abruptly upped and left in the 4th century BC. Simply put, he vanished from the roadways and refused to return ever since. Rejected the idea of continuing to interact with his stepfather in any way. When Augustus became enraged and applied as much pressure as he could, Tiberius, who was notoriously irritable, simply could not take it any longer. The fact that he had left was the end of it. A wrench of this magnitude was thrown into the works, and it was large enough to throw everything off balance. In spite of the fact that Augustus started making significant investments in Gaius and Lucius, it appeared like fate was destined to make fun of him. At the age of only 19, Lucius passed away due to an illness while he was traveling to Gaul. In the year 2 AD, 24 years later, a Goth who was 24 years old traveled to a town that was under siege and wounded himself during the siege. In the meantime, the wound became infected, and that was the end of the gas. Thereafter, Agrippa and Julia had a second son who was born shortly after Agrippa passed away. But when he got older, he turned out to be such a rude and violent prick. This Augustus did not even think twice about allowing him to reside in Rome and instead exiled him to a distant island. This is how it came to pass that the first citizen, in the year 6 AD, had a deeply depressing conclusion. He was going to have to beg Tiberius to come back for going if he wanted to get his hands on an application. He was never going to have to beg for anything. There is no doubt that it was the most humiliating dish it has ever been forced to consume. Nevertheless, Liberius was in the mood for a good time. After flouncing off for a couple of years, Tiberius came to the realization that it had made a fundamental error. Nevertheless, he was unable to return because of a combination of his own pride and Augustus's epic anger that he held him back. On the other hand, the moments of his journey have finally returned and arrived at this point. And because Tiberius already had a bit of a reputation for being a gigantic dickhead, this was something that everyone in Rome found to be a bit of an issue. Tiberius was a snobby, uncooperative, and arrogant individual. Even though he was not a monster-like individual, it was because so few people wanted Tiberius to sit on the throne of the empire that Augustus had to coerce him into adopting his handsome nephew Germanicus, who was 20 years old at the time. This meant that regardless of how terrible Tiberius's rule was, the emperor who succeeded him would be a well-liked figure. In addition, you will need to skip ahead and view films of Tiberius in Caligula in order to get a better understanding of how horribly fate messed up that specific plan. There are out-of-sight areas to Rome marks the effective end of Augustus's time as a significant ruler. George remained, and perhaps ever more years, and even found time to make an impact on the literary world, both by writing Deeds of the Divine Augustus and the exiling poet Ovid, for reasons that still remain tantalizingly mysterious. By this point, the elderly guy was aware that the most important deed of his life had come to an end. 1980 was the year that Augustus resigned from public life, and Tiberius took over the majority of the day-to-day operations of the state instead. Almost immediately after assuming power, Tiberius initiated a gradual repression of the rights of the people, which would eventually lead to the establishment of his own authoritarian dictatorship. Nevertheless, it is a given that Augustus would not be present to see this due to yet another repeated attack with illness. Augustus withdrew to a villa located below Mount Vesuvius at the beginning of the year 1480. He remained in a state of hiding. However, there would be no miracle recovery this time due to the circumstances. There is no way back from the edge. Finally, after spending his entire existence on the verge of passing away, Augustus crosses the boundary and enters the afterlife. The only thing we can do is hope that he spotted his longtime friend Marcus Agrippa while he was doing that, on the opposite side, ready and waiting for him to arrive. In August of 1914 AD, Augustus passed away when he was 76 years old. It was at this point that he had controlled Rome for more than 40 years, making his reign the longest of any emperor's reign. He had shaped the fortunes of the empire in ways that no one would ever be able to recreate. In light of this, his funeral procession was of gigantic proportions. Following the cremation of the first citizen, he was elevated to the status of a god. However, even after he had passed away and been buried, Augustus continued to have influence over official policy. In addition, Augustus urged those who followed him to refrain from expanding the empire any further. In addition, with the exception of Claudius's conquest of Britain, no other emperor would defy this until Trajan appeared on the scene, almost a century later, when that extraordinary life was coming to a close. As for the individual who was formerly known as Octavian, what else is there to say? Without a shadow of a doubt, he continues to represent one of the most significant individuals who have ever lived. He is very possibly the most significant pick of any other so-called great guy in history, with the exception of the founders of religions. This is true regardless of whether Napoleon Bonaparte, Abraham Lincoln, Simon Bolivar, or Genghis Khan are being considered candidates. In comparison to the brilliance of Augustus, which is comparable to a firefly next to a supernova, this brilliance is a little speck of light. The Roman Empire was established by this individual, who was responsible for laying the groundwork for a superpower that would continue to exist for another 450 years. If Augustus had not existed, the entire history of the Western world would have been very different. The names Claudius and Nero, which were common household names, did not even exist. On the other hand, even if we disregard the butterfly effect, Augustus was a man who deserves to be honored as the first citizen himself. As I once stated in an honest manner, I discovered Rome to be a city made of bricks, but I left it a city made of marble. The ill young boy who grew up to become Rome's first and greatest emperor deserves a memorable epitaph, but what could possibly be more fitting?